It started as one of those disappearances people think can't really happen in real life anymore. Not in a quiet mid-income complex in Columbus. Not to a woman like Claire Donovan. Claire was 27, a medical records coordinator who showed up on time, paid her rent early, and wrote every appointment in blue ink on a paper calendar. On February 10, 1994, she left work at 4:34 p.m., walked into her building carrying a grocery bag. And that is the last moment anyone can say with certainty that they saw her alive. The next days made less and less sense. Her car stayed in its parking spot. Her coat and purse were left inside the apartment. The bed was still made. The TV and living room light were left on through the night. No signs of a fight. No signs of a break-in. The front door locked from the outside. Somebody was able to walk into Claire's world, remove her from it, close the door behind them, and vanish without leaving the kind of evidence police in 1994 knew how to read. We're going to walk through what happened in Brookhill Court step by step. If you care about cases that never should have gone cold, hit like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments what you think happened to Claire Donovan. Brookhill Court sat on the quieter edge of Columbus, Ohio, a mid-income apartment complex built in 1981, made up of 3 floors and 24 units. Most tenants were regular working adults with predictable routines: medical assistants, office clerks, repair technicians, pharmacy staff, and a few retail workers who lived alone to be close to public transportation. The neighborhood had a reputation for being safe, with a low crime rate and only minor disturbances reported over the years, usually noise complaints or property maintenance requests. A bus stop sat just down the sidewalk. A convenience store stayed open until late, and a family-run general clinic was located 2 short blocks away. Nothing about the environment suggested risk, instability, or a reason to fear unexpected danger. Unit 2A belonged to a 27-year-old woman named Claire Donovan, who signed a 12-month lease in August of 1993. She lived alone, paid rent on time through automatic bank transfer, and never reported housing concerns or requested maintenance services. She did not register overnight guests or roommates and did not appear to entertain visitors frequently. Neighbors mentioned that they often heard her apartment door open and close at consistent hours, reflecting a stable routine rather than social activity. She owned no pets, kept no extended stay guests, and did not ask for building exceptions or special permissions. Claire worked full-time as a medical records coordinator at Riverside Medical Associates, scheduled Monday through Friday from 8 in the morning to 4:30 in the afternoon. Her job required consistent data entry, documentation approval, and accuracy with confidential patient files. Co-workers described her as quiet but reliable, someone who rarely missed a deadline and avoided workplace conflict. One colleague later said, "You always knew that if Claire said she would finish something by the end of the day, it would be there." She did not socialize much, but she was not viewed as unfriendly, more like someone who maintained personal space and professional boundaries. Employment records showed no active disciplinary issues, no write-ups, and no ongoing performance concerns. She did not request schedule changes, leave extensions, or accommodations. There was no known romantic involvement inside the workplace, and no documented complaints filed by or against her. Her attendance pattern during the 6 months before her disappearance was recorded as perfect, without tardiness, unexplained breaks, or last-minute leave requests. Medical documentation indicated that she was physically healthy and not undergoing therapy or psychiatric treatment. She did not collect prescription medication on a regular basis, did not report chronic illness, and did not appear on pharmacy pickup logs for controlled substances. Interviews and financial records confirmed she was not carrying credit card debt and did not have a history of late payments. She kept a modest lifestyle with stable expenses and no sudden changes in spending behavior. Regarding personal relationships, Claire had ended a prior relationship with a man named Eric Dalton about 6 months before the timeline in question. The breakup had not been documented through legal complaints, restraining orders, or third-party intervention. Both parties continued to live in separate Ohio neighborhoods, and no known direct communication or physical interaction occurred in the 30 days leading up to her disappearance. Family lived out of state in Indiana and connected with Claire by phone every 2 weeks, describing the communication as routine, calm, and without signs of distress. They did not visit often due to distance and work schedules, but they did not describe tension or unresolved issues. Claire maintained a small but consistent personal routine that included keeping a handwritten planner using blue ink. She was known to track her work deadlines, dentist appointments, paydays, and occasional errands. She did not note emotional reminders or diary-style entries, but rather simple, factual notations. Inside that planner, dated February 10, 1994, was a red ink circle, one of the only markings in a color other than blue. There was no written explanation beside it, no initials, address, or event description. It was the only red marking during the entire month. Neighbors rarely interacted with her beyond basic greetings. They recalled her returning home at predictable hours, carrying a paper grocery bag or work tote, and locking her door immediately after entering. One resident explained, "She wasn't rude, she just looked like someone who came home to rest, not to talk." She was not seen participating in shared social areas like the courtyard seating, parking lot chats, or building holiday gatherings. Mail carriers and package delivery drivers reported no unusual behavior or conversation. Building management confirmed that Claire did not request additional keys, badge access, or temporary passes. She never changed her lock, made noise complaints, reported harassment, or asked for unit transfers. There was no official sign of fear, distrust, or concern toward neighbors, building staff, or external visitors. She appeared to occupy her space quietly, without drawing attention or showing signs of dispute or instability. Her apartment lease file, banking records, and work attendance log all displayed consistency, without any disappearance-suggestive patterns. No final withdrawals, no storage rentals, no travel reservations, no sudden resignations, and no financial shutdown behaviors. She did not buy luggage, did not make phone calls about relocation, and did not mention leaving her position at Riverside. On paper, Claire Donovan represented one of the most common resident profiles in mid-1990s urban apartment housing. A working adult, financially independent, living alone, socially low exposure, and routine-driven. There were no red flags that preceded her disappearance, except for one unexplained calendar circle dated February 10th. Closed in meaning, clear in timing, but silent in purpose. Everything about Claire suggested stability, predictability, and quiet normalcy. and for many investigators who later reviewed her file. That became the most unsettling part. Cases that start with chaos show their direction early. Cases that begin in complete order leave no map at all. On February 10, 1994, everything about Claire Donovan's routine looked stable, predictable, and consistent with how she had lived since moving into Unit 2A at Brookhill Court. That Thursday, she clocked out of Riverside Medical Associates at 4:34 p.m., captured clearly on the lobby security camera as she pushed the glass door open with a small folder tucked under her arm. According to the timestamp, she did not appear rushed or distressed. One of her co-workers later stated, "Claire left exactly how she always did, quiet, focused, and ready to head home. Nothing seemed off. She didn't stop by her desk again, didn't return for forgotten items, and didn't mention any personal concerns to anyone before leaving the building." Earlier that day, her behavior matched every prior weekday pattern investigators managed to document. She arrived on time at 7:58 a.m., logged into the hospital record system at 8:01 a.m., completed a file reconciliation task before lunch, and exchanged short, work-related comments with 2 colleagues about overdue paperwork. She declined a casual hallway conversation about weekend plans. Nothing in her communicative behavior suggested agitation, anxiety, fear, or urgency. At 4:12 p.m., an employee from another department asked if she wanted to grab a quick coffee after work. Claire politely declined and gave a short explanation. She needed to get home early to finish a couple of things. She did not specify what those things were.
The final confirmed sighting away from her residence occurred outside the hospital building, near the south parking area. The weather that evening was cold but dry, with no rain or snow reported. She carried only a small tan handbag and what appeared to be a grocery store receipt partially sticking out from her coat pocket. Investigators later confirmed that she made a stop at a nearby convenience market. No alcohol, no medication, no large purchases, and nothing unusual in quantity or product category. Around 5:05 p.m., a resident from the second floor positively identified seeing Claire enter Brookhill Court through the main door. She held a brown grocery bag with light items that did not appear heavy. The resident described her as moving calm, not hurried, not nervous, just normal after-work pace. She did not speak to anyone, did not appear followed, and did not interact with anyone in the lobby. This became the last known external confirmation of her presence. At approximately 6 p.m., the living room lights inside Unit 2A were observed through Claire's front window sheer curtains. Investigators determined that this indicated occupancy, or at minimum, that she arrived and used the apartment normally after returning home. The heating system and kitchen power usage logs later corroborated that someone was inside the apartment during early evening hours. When forensic investigators entered 2 days later, they found a stainless steel pot on the stovetop with signs of very recent boiling. The heat had long dissipated by then, but the mineral rings around the waterline suggested it had been heated and left unattended. Phone service logs confirmed that no outgoing or incoming calls were made using Claire's landline after 6:10 p.m. She had no active pager service, no personal cell phone, and no email usage that evening, typical for most residents in 1994. There was also no record of emergency calls, operator services, or attempted dialing. Nothing digital suggested external contact or distress. The apartment answering machine remained empty. The Brookhill Court visitor and service log, kept in a binder at the building office, did not list any non-resident arrivals after Claire came home. No delivery drivers, no maintenance personnel, no friends, and no tenants from other buildings signed in that night. There were no family visits scheduled, no romantic meetups, and no professional drop-offs planned. When police later verified entries from residents, nobody reported unexpected knocks, unfamiliar voices, or any hallway presence that would imply additional movement on the floor. Rience also asked every apartment on either side of Unit 2A and in vertical proximity. Residents in Units 2B, 2C, 1A, and 3A reported a quiet night with regular household sounds only. A neighbor later told detectives there was nothing strange, no yelling, no loud footsteps, no banging. Everything sounded like any other normal Thursday night. No one recalled hearing Claire open or close her door after returning home, and no one noted a second voice inside. On the morning of February 11th, a newspaper carrier delivering copies through the hallway noticed the lights inside Claire's living room were still on at approximately 5:40 a.m. The carrier had passed by Unit 2A many times before and recognized that it was unusual for lights to remain on overnight in that particular apartment. The carrier did not hear any noise nor observe movement inside the unit, but could clearly see indoor illumination through the curtains. When authorities eventually accessed the apartment on February 12th, they discovered that the front door had been locked from the outside using a physical key, not from inside via interior latch. There was no visible scratching, damage, tool marking, or strike plate disruption. That detail immediately altered investigative direction, because it suggested one of two unsettling possibilities. Either Claire left willingly with someone who possessed a key, or someone entered and exited the unit without leaving obvious signs of forced entry. The combination of a normal emotional profile, lack of communication attempts, abandoned household activity mid-routine, lights left burning overnight, and a door locked externally formed the earliest official red flag sequence of the case. Investigators classified this as a timeline with confirmed entry but unconfirmed exit, making the evening of February 10th the last provable period during which Claire was inside her home and believed to be alive.
The absence of noise or struggle, paired with the controlled environment of a secure apartment building, made the situation even more difficult to interpret. No witness recalled hearing distress, and no resident came forward to report suspicious sounds. The peaceful surroundings, the limited access structure, and the silent nature of the scene created a case foundation built not on what happened, but on what did not happen, and what could not be easily disproven. The entire official investigative timeline stops at 6 p.m. on February 10th, with no factual evidence indicating when, how, or with whom Claire may have exited her unit. Every detail after that point shifts from certainty into hypothesis. And in a missing persons investigation, a silent apartment can be more frightening than one showing signs of chaos. Because silence often hides someone who had time, access, and intention. For 2 consecutive workdays, February 11th and 12th of 1994, Claire Donovan did not appear at Riverside Medical Associates, the clinic where she worked as a medical records coordinator. She had never been late, never missed a shift without notice, and had no disciplinary history on file. Her absence immediately stood out because she worked in a department where daily staffing accuracy was essential. When she did not clock in on the morning of February 11th, her supervisor initially assumed a misunderstanding or minor illness. When she failed to appear again the following morning, It stopped feeling like a scheduling error and began resembling a break in a well-established pattern. Human Resources attempted to reach her repeatedly through the landline registered to apartment 2A, the number she used for all work-related communication. The phone rang continuously with no answer, no voicemail pickup, and no call redirection. The silence did not align with Claire's professional identity, especially considering she handled patients' confidential information and was required to report any absence. One co-worker recalled the office mood shifting quickly from confusion to unease. She later said, "It just didn't fit her. She wouldn't disappear without saying a word. Something wasn't right." By Friday afternoon, her colleagues contacted her family in Indiana, asking whether Claire had mentioned feeling sick, traveling, or experiencing any unexpected personal situation. Her parents told them they hadn't spoken with her since the evening of February 10th, exactly 2 nights earlier. They had no missed calls, no messages, and no requests for help or advice. Under normal circumstances, her 2-week check-ins were predictable and polite. But she had never gone silent this long without context. After more than 48 hours of failed contact attempts, her workplace made the official decision to file a missing person report. The call was placed to the Columbus Police Department on the afternoon of February 12th at 2:55 p.m. The responding unit arrived at Brookhill Court to conduct a welfare check as the first step of protocol. Because no one answered the door, and there was no prior authorization from Claire, officers requested access from building management. The apartment manager used the master emergency key and entered under police supervision to document the first interior impression, without disturbing the environment. Inside the unit, there were no immediate signs of chaos, visible injury, or struggle. The living room appeared organized. A coat she routinely wore to work remained hanging near the entryway. Her wallet, state ID, medical insurance card, and bank cards were located inside the kitchen area, where she usually stored personal items after returning home. Nothing was scattered or overturned. Nothing indicated haste. Even the placement of her belongings implied she had arrived with routine intention, not rushed or alarmed. On the stovetop, officers found a small pot containing water that had been recently heated. The metal was still slightly warm to the touch, confirming that heating occurred not long before her disappearance window. The stove itself was switched off, suggesting an interruptive moment rather than forgetfulness. This detail became an important timestamp anchor, because it supported the idea that she began a normal evening task soon after arriving home. Investigators noted that this type of interrupted preparation would be unusual if she had chosen to leave voluntarily. No suitcases, overnight bags, backpacks, or significant clothing items were missing from the bedroom closet. Her shoes were aligned in pairs, and nothing indicated packing or travel planning. Police determined there was no sign of voluntary relocation, late-night departure, or planned trip. The bed was neatly made, with no impressions on the pillows or sheets that would indicate sleep or rest. These details reinforced the working theory that Claire did not spend the night inside her apartment after returning from work. Officers inspected all possible exit points. Both the balcony door and window locks were secured from inside. There were no pry marks, damaged latches, loosened frames, torn screens, or tool scratches that might indicate covert entry. With pathways eliminated and no interior compromise found, the question shifted from how someone might have entered the apartment to how Claire had left, and under what circumstances. On her work desk, a basic paper calendar showed a handwritten red circle around February 10th, the date of her last confirmed sighting. No written note, event title, appointment name, or time reference explained its meaning. It was unlike her typical schedule marks, which were always labeled with clear reference points, such as dentist, payday, or file audit. Detectives logged the calendar as a potential contextual clue, because it could reference a meeting, deadline, or personal errand that she did not publicly mention. Along standard procedure, officers initiated a formal missing person file, assigned under ID code CCM 94-2A, with classification listed as missing under suspicious circumstances. The choice of classification stemmed from multiple factors: lack of contact, lack of voluntary departure indicators, interrupted household activity, and absence of eyewitness confirmation that Claire ever exited the building after approximately 5:05 p.m. on February 10th. The apartment was sealed, documented, and designated for forensic entry at a later stage rather than immediate invasive processing. In the building hallway, investigators conducted informal doorstep inquiries, asking whether residents remembered anything unusual that night. No one reported sounds consistent with distress, argument, furniture movement, or calls for help. One neighbor summarized the night by saying, "Everything was quiet. Nothing felt out of the ordinary. If something happened, none of us heard it." With no auditory evidence, no visual witness, and no departure confirmation, the timeline moved from unusual absence to unexplained disappearance. Police emphasized that no theory could be favored at this stage. There was no evidence suggesting she ran away, no evidence supporting self-harm, and no indication of physical force. The case began not with spectacle, chaos, or dramatic confrontation, but with stillness, items left untouched, and a normal evening that simply never concluded. The unanswered question did not begin with why. It began with when, how, and under whose control the final minutes occurred. The interviews began less than 2 hours after the apartment was sealed, and investigators moved floor by floor, starting with residents who shared walls, ceilings, or direct line of sound with Unit 2A. The goal was to find anything that stood out: noises, footsteps, a door closing at an unusual hour, or any sign that Claire had been with someone after she entered her home at 5:05 p.m. The interviews also had a secondary purpose: to understand the habits of those who lived closest to her, because cases like this often hinge on small behavioral details rather than dramatic scenes. Residents on all 3 floors described the night of February 10th as ordinary and quiet. No arguments, no sudden bangs on walls, no sound of running water for long periods, and no patterns that suggested panic, injury, or forced conflict. The resident in 2C, who lived directly adjacent to Claire, recalled only one detail worth noting: the living room light in 2A stayed on far longer than normal. She said, "It never turned off. I remember noticing it around midnight and again when I woke up after sunrise. I didn't think anything was wrong, but it was unusual." No one reported hearing Claire leave her apartment, and no one reported hearing her voice after she arrived home. When questioned about building access, the property manager provided a clean breakdown. Only 3 parties could open Claire's door without damage: Claire herself, who carried the main key; management, who held the master key set; and the maintenance support team, who had emergency access under approved work requests. There was no digital entry system in 1994, and no sign-in requirement for internal staff. which meant access was legally restricted but not electronically traceable. There were no functioning cameras in hallways, staircases, or the parking lot that year, and the only working security camera was inside the lobby of Claire's workplace, not her residence. Investigators then turned attention to work-related stressors. Human Resources at Riverside Medical Associates provided Claire's recent performance notes, attendance logs, deadline records, and supervisor reviews. Everything was consistent, stable, and well-maintained. There was no indication that she feared someone at work, planned to leave her job, or expressed distress about personal matters. A co-worker, when asked if Claire ever confided about tension or fear, responded, "She didn't talk much about her personal life, but she always seemed steady, like someone who followed a plan." None of her communications from the prior month showed any unusual tone, hidden messages, or references to someone new entering her life. Attention then shifted toward whether anyone unfamiliar could have entered the building during the evening of February 10th. Investigators reviewed the visitor and service logbook covering the entire week of the incident. No entries showed non-residents arriving or staying inside the building after 5 p.m. There were no registered food deliveries, no package signatures, no emergency contractor check-ins, and no family or friends recorded. Every name listed belonged to a tenant who lived there and had been verified face-to-face. From there, detectives reviewed financial activity. Claire paid rent through automatic withdrawal, kept her personal accounts stable, and maintained a quiet financial profile with no withdrawal spikes, travel purchases, or cash-on-hand preparations. Her account history for the 10 days leading up to February 10th showed routine purchases, groceries, work lunches, and one small pharmacy transaction. After her estimated time of disappearance, there were no ATM withdrawals, no debit card activity, and no attempts to use her bank identity anywhere in Ohio or surrounding states. Since the building had no surveillance system, investigators needed to question people who would logically have access to restricted spaces. Maintenance names were reviewed, cross-checked with weekly work requests, and matched against the sign-in sheet in the storage office. That was when the name Mark Ellison appeared. He was a subcontracted maintenance worker hired on call rather than on a fixed shift. He repaired minor electrical issues, plumbing concerns, and lock adjustments only when residents filed requests through management. His presence in the building was described as periodic but familiar, meaning tenants recognized him but did not track when or why he was there. Detectives verified that Mark had been inside Brookhill Court multiple times during the 3 weeks leading up to Claire's disappearance. When cross-referenced against recorded maintenance requests, not every visit aligned with a documented repair entry. Investigators noted that some of his appearances could not be tied directly to a scheduled work order, leaving several unaccounted visits unexplained. Because subcontractors did not carry pagers or digital logs at the time, the absence of scheduling documentation was not enough to prove misconduct, but was enough to raise investigative attention. Further questioning of residents uncovered that Mark often worked alone and moved between technical spaces such as electrical closets, pipe access points, and utility doors. He did not require supervision because his work type was categorized as facility internal. Residents described him as polite, quiet, and focused. One resident said, "He didn't talk much. He just nodded, did his work, and left." Another resident mentioned seeing him near the stairway of the second floor at unknown hours within the same 3-week period. The final interview round focused on access levels, not personality. Mark had legal authority to enter wiring rooms, pipe recesses, crawl spaces, and the locked utility hallway that connected multiple floors behind the structural walls. While he did not automatically have permission to enter apartments without consent or request approval, his emergency keycard and manual keyring gave him the potential to reach areas that typical residents could not. The fact that Claire's unit was found locked from the outside added weight to the possibility that someone with authorized access used a standard exit rather than forced entry. With no sound disturbances, no signs of struggle, no technology capturing movement, and no physical evidence showing exit or escape, the investigation slowly shifted from outside threat theory to internal access theory. The absence of forced entry suggested that the person responsible did not need to break in. They could enter smoothly, quietly, and without alarming anyone inside or around the building.
At the end of this stage, investigators did not have proof, accusation grounds, or motive conclusions. What they had was a pattern. Claire entered her home. The routine inside her apartment stopped abruptly, and the only meaningful investigative direction remaining involved someone whose role never required suspicion. The investigation moved into a new phase once detectives confirmed that Claire Donovan had not left her apartment voluntarily, and that no physical evidence suggested a break-in. The next logical step was to identify every person who had any personal, emotional, or routine connection strong enough to justify becoming part of an early suspect list. Detectives worked under 3 key filters: who had a prior relationship with Claire, who lived close enough to act without drawing attention, and who had any documented behavior that could raise concern or indicate instability. From that foundation, 3 names were entered into the initial case file: her former boyfriend, a workplace acquaintance, and a resident known for alcohol-related disruptions. The first person evaluated was Eric Dalton, Claire's ex-boyfriend. Claire and Eric had ended their relationship 6 months before she disappeared, and both sides reportedly moved on without legal conflict or continued confrontation. Eric lived in Westerville, roughly 25 to 30 minutes by car from Brookhill Court, and there was no confirmed meeting between them within the month before she disappeared. Detectives found a recorded missed call from Eric's number sometime within 48 hours before Claire was last seen. The exact purpose of that call was unclear. It could have been casual, emotional, accidental, or urgent. But there was no voicemail or follow-up attempt registered afterward. When police met with Eric, he expressed shock and confusion, insisting that he thought Claire was doing well without him, and that they had not argued since their breakup. One investigator later summarized, "There's motive potential, but nothing points to contact or confrontation." The second name placed on the list was Daniel Pierce, one of Claire's co-workers at Riverside Medical Associates. Daniel worked the same shift as Claire, and had spoken to her regularly about work-related matters. Several colleagues confirmed that Daniel once asked Claire out for a casual coffee meeting outside of work, but she declined in a polite, straightforward manner. No one recalled tension or resentment afterward. His digital work log showed no complaints filed against him, no disciplinary write-ups, and no emails or handwritten notes suggesting persistence or fixation. Daniel told investigators, "There was nothing uncomfortable between us. She was quiet, but I respected that.
Detectives noted that although Daniel had a slight emotional motive based on interest, he did not have confirmed presence, access, or behavioral red flags, and there was no evidence placing him near the apartment complex on the night Claire disappeared. The final name in the initial suspect group was Riley Morgan, a resident who lived on the first floor of Brookhill Court. Riley was known for occasional drunken outbursts during 1993, involving loud noise, yelling in the hallway, and knocking on the wrong doors while intoxicated. Several neighbors remembered those events clearly. One resident recalled, "He was loud sometimes, but mostly he was just drunk and confused." No one reported seeing him interact or speak with Claire, and there were no records linking the two socially or romantically. There was also no evidence of him being near Claire's unit or the stairwell during the evening she returned home. Riley admitted to drinking at home on some evenings, but he denied any involvement and appeared confused when told Claire was missing. With the first three suspects identified, detectives compared motive probability against confirmed opportunity. The emotional motive range for each suspect was considered low to moderate, based primarily on past personal connection, mild interest, or history of disruptive behavior, but not based on verified agitation, direct confrontation, or romantic pursuit at the time of the disappearance. For each potential suspect, detectives searched for three things that could shift them from a standard inquiry to a prioritized threat: proof of proximity during the time window, signs of secret or unapproved access, or statements that conflicted with documented records. None of the three men had confirmed access to Claire's apartment, either through key ownership, professional authorization, or evidence of possessing copied or stolen entry tools. Claire did not report missing items, keys, or attempted break-ins in the months leading up to the disappearance. There was no history of restraining orders, confrontational phone calls, written threats, or suspicious gifts. According to police, cell phones were not widely used in 1994, so landline calls and in-person interactions were most relevant. That limited the investigative trail but also simplified what would count as evidence of planning. Detectives confirmed that not one of the three was placed at the stairwell, parking lot, mail area, or building entrance by any resident statement. Despite lack of confirmed presence, detectives could not eliminate relational motive entirely. Each person still fell within the standard investigative playbook: past partner, workplace connection, and a neighbor with unpredictable behavior. All three were scheduled for follow-up interviews to verify timelines, background stability, and emotional history. Detectives also reviewed potential triggers such as jealousy, loneliness, anger, alcohol influence, or unresolved attachment. But no direct marker became clear. When asked about Claire, one coworker responded, "She stayed neutral. She wasn't the type to argue or create problems. She kept her life private, and most people respected that." The absence of conflict or documented hostility among the suspect list created an unusual situation. It was rare for a missing person case with suspicious conditions to have three suspects with motive potential, but no traceable path to opportunity. Investigators wrote in the internal file that the likelihood of an emotional or impulsive act seemed thin without evidence of heated exchange, stalking, or threats. Opportunity required access, and access required either permission or some form of system breach. At this stage, none of the suspects had legal, professional, or practical entry to the apartment, and no one reported seeing them near the building that evening. The suspect list remained open but did not escalate into confrontation or surveillance orders. Detectives viewed the trio not as probable offenders but as individuals worth monitoring, in case future evidence reshaped the picture. The real turning point would not come from emotional theory but from understanding who had advantage, timing, and lawful or disguised entry capability. With emotional-based suspects standing still and physical access suspects not yet examined, the case moved quietly but steadily toward an angle no one had expected at the beginning. The search for Claire moved into its most methodical stage within 48 hours of the missing report, when investigators established a 2-mile search radius around Brookhill Court. This radius covered the shared parking lot, a connected alleyway behind the dumpster line, a small public park along the walking trail, and the bus overpass leading toward the main road. Every section was walked, photographed, and flagged, but there was nothing that could be linked to Claire or anything she might have carried that evening. Grocery bags, receipts, clothing items, notebooks, or cards were not recovered anywhere in that perimeter. Waste management became the second priority when detectives realized how short the time window was between her last verified sighting and the next collection cycle. Trash bins, recycling containers, and transportation roll-offs were examined for any item that resembled identification: handwritten notes, damaged clothing, a grocery bag with purchase labels, or portable personal items. Every bag from February 10th to February 12th was cut open and recorded. No item matched Claire's belongings listed in the apartment inventory. Forensic capabilities in 1994 presented a challenge from the beginning. Microtrace evidence such as skin cells, protein residue, micro-sized fibers, or microscopic biological transfers were not testable with the same accuracy available decades later. Investigators were limited to visible stains, hair, blood, fingerprints, shoe impressions, or signs of struggle. None of those were discovered inside Unit 2A, nor did the entryway carpet, kitchen tiles, bathroom flooring, or bedroom area show any disturbance that would suggest forced contact. Hair samples found inside the apartment matched Claire's expected grooming pattern. No broken nails, scratch marks, pulled fibers, or blood droplets were located on walls, counters, or door frames. The bedding remained neat, unwrinkled, and looked exactly like someone who planned to return to it later that night. The kitchen counter held a half-opened box of tea, and the electric stove retained faint warmth, confirming that heat was applied sometime shortly after she returned home. Detectives believed she had started a basic evening routine, but never completed it. Because no signs of forced entry appeared on the lock cylinder or door plate, the working assumption became that the door was secured with a key after Claire was no longer inside. Investigators inspected the hardware with magnification for scrape marks, chipped paint, or displaced metal shavings, but nothing indicated a burglary attempt or the use of a foreign tool. The absence of damage suggested entry by someone who either had legal access or had handled the lock with familiarity. When the hallways and stairs were arranged, no shoe impressions, drag marks, spill traces, or disturbed carpet fibers were found. Outdoor areas offered similar results. The weather had been dry, eliminating mud or wet prints that might have preserved movement patterns. Residents were questioned about hearing unusual footsteps or the sound of someone moving heavy objects, and everyone interviewed offered nearly identical responses. One resident said, "I didn't hear anything at all. If something happened, it happened very quietly." Another said, "People here usually mind their own business. Nights are calm. Nothing stood out."
Police verified every registered vehicle inside the parking area between 5 p.m. on February 10th and 7 a.m. the following morning. License plates, resident vehicle lists, visitor tags, and temporary permits were cross-checked for departure or unusual early morning exits. None matched the profile of someone attempting a rapid or discreet clearance. No car was recorded leaving during late hours with covered cargo, and no neighbor reported engine noise inconsistent with normal activity. The timeline required that investigators also return to the 3 initial suspects and test whether the lack of forensic evidence could still be consistent with one of them. Each man provided partial alibis that placed them away from Brookhill Court for significant portions of the evening, though overlapping gray areas remained. Because no physical evidence placed them near Unit 2A, the case could not advance on physical confirmation or timeline contradiction. Detectives documented each of their statements, but were not able to connect any of them with a verified opportunity window inside the apartment. Without video surveillance from hallways, stairwells, parking lots, or the service entrance, investigators were deprived of the visual confirmation usually needed to evaluate paths, travel time, or unauthorized presence. Brookhill Court, like many mid-income properties built before modern systems, relied solely on keyed access and manual logging instead of digital entry tracking. There were no magnetic key cards, no motion-triggered cameras, and no time-stamped electronic entry system that could expose who entered or exited during the critical period. Without digital evidence, the case became more dependent on human memory, which investigators recognized as unreliable under stress. A second walkthrough focused on maintenance areas, including the electrical room, utility passage, supply storage, and pipe access spaces. None of these areas contained discarded personal items, fabric tears, or evidence of recent concealment. The wood-framed closet for electrical meters had dust patterns consistent with long-term undisturbed surfaces. The storage room flooring showed no new scuffing or compressed marks that would suggest someone dragged a bag or box through the area. Detectives also opened each ceiling tile above the hallway and verified that insulation and dust remained unbroken. With every forensic angle closing, the detective team drafted a status summary stating that no physical evidence confirmed Claire leaving the apartment, no digital evidence confirmed an intruder, and no environmental evidence confirmed a struggle, disposal attempt, or relocation. Because the case lacked a confirmed exit point, working theories now depended on access privilege, timing, and behavioral review rather than physical trail reconstruction. The log entry that ultimately closed this investigative phase summarized the deadlock in clear, unemotional language, noting that the case could not progress on forensic evidence alone and required deeper review of movement patterns, access authority, and indirect testimony. It concluded with the line, "No physical evidence, no confirmed exit, no verified timeline breach. Case dependent on interview expansion and non-forensic leads."
The file then transitioned into cold review status, awaiting the next actionable direction. 4 days after Claire Donovan was last seen walking into Brookhill Court, the case moved from quiet confusion to public attention. On February 15, 1994, the Columbus Weekly Herald published a front-page article describing her disappearance as unusual, unexplained, and lacking any trace of voluntary departure. That headline changed the pace of the case. Until that moment, most residents believed Claire might have taken time away on her own terms, or that there had been a misunderstanding connected to work or family. The article challenged that assumption and framed the situation as something that didn't fit any familiar pattern. As soon as it circulated around town and reached mailboxes in Brookhill Court, A new wave of calls, recollections, and late-arriving observations began to surface. Among them was a message from a first-floor resident who told police that she remembered seeing Claire near the maintenance access room 1 or 2 times in the weeks before she vanished. Her statement was short, but it introduced a connection that had not been considered with any seriousness prior to media exposure. She told officers, "I can't say it was a full conversation, but it looked like they spoke. It was quick, like checking something, and then they walked off." This was the first witness link indicating that Claire may have interacted with someone whose name was not on the original suspect list. When investigators contacted the building manager to confirm who the resident might have been referring to, the answer was immediate. Mark Ellison, part-time maintenance subcontractor. His name had been recorded several times on weekly service sheets, though he was not employed full-time and did not maintain a fixed shift. Unlike the office management team, Mark possessed a technical ID card granting him access to the electrical control space, pipe system chambers, and internal utility corridors. That access remained valid beyond regular business hours when emergency requests were filed or when work needed follow-through. Police then interviewed several additional tenants across all 3 floors, asking not what they thought about Claire, but what they remembered about Mark. Almost all of them described him consistently. Quiet, polite, did his job and left. No one reported loud arguments, suspicious behavior, or inappropriate interactions. Several residents mentioned seeing him repair hallway bulbs, adjust pipe valves, or check wiring without holding long conversations, which made him blend into the building routine without raising questions. That general perception mattered because it illustrated how familiar access can be mistaken for harmless presence. When someone appears to be part of a building's normal rhythm, people rarely analyze movement, location, or timing. The context gave investigators reason to adjust their perspective. Danger may have come not from forcing entry, but from already belonging inside the system that protected everyone else. Case records then confirmed an important detail. Mark was the only listed maintenance staff member with direct authorization to enter the utility infrastructure that connected multiple floors without passing through public hallways. These areas were typically ignored by residents, not monitored, and lacked camera coverage. It became essential to know when he accessed those spaces and why. A witness from the 2nd floor then shared another memory, stating that she had seen Mark in the floor 2 corridor several times in the week before Claire disappeared. She noted that she didn't see tools or cleaning supplies with him each time and assumed he was on his way to inspect something electrical or technical. At that point, the frequency of his presence began to matter more than his personality. It raised the question of whether he had business to handle or if he was simply present without explanation, unnoticed by everyone because he appeared to be working. When investigators requested a short interview, Mark cooperated, but his answers were brief, sometimes nondescriptive, and rarely expanded beyond what the officers asked. He did not attempt to deny his presence inside the building, nor did he express surprise that his name was included in the inquiry. According to the report, he stated only that he handled small maintenance requests and follow-ups, and that he couldn't remember exact timestamps without checking paperwork. He did not volunteer further detail. Police then cross-checked his statements with building records. His entry logs and paperwork timestamps did not fully match the information he recalled. None of the discrepancies were dramatic or incriminating on their own, but the lack of exact matches meant the timeline required deeper verification. His role gave him access. His movement was semi-documented, and no other resident, including the original 3 suspects, shared any comparable proximity, capability, or facility-level permission. With this combination of access plus presence plus timeline gaps, investigators made a procedural shift. The case officially moved from a general missing person inquiry to a potential insider access case, prioritizing questions about how someone with internal knowledge could move, observe, or act without detection inside a quiet 3-floor residential property with no surveillance system. At that stage, detectives drafted a new question set focusing not on emotional relationships, but on movement rationale, off-schedule visibility, proximity explanations, and task documentation. They also began mapping the utility system pathing, including all spaces accessible but typically ignored by tenants. The final entry in the Part 7 phase of the case record stated clearly and without speculation: investigative direction will now prioritize access analysis, technical pathway review, and movement justification surrounding Unit 2A and adjoining infrastructure. No suspect was named as responsible. No accusation was made. No conclusion was drawn. Only the angle of investigation changed, and from this moment forward, access became more meaningful than motive. The investigation reached a point where emotional connections, past relationships, and personal conflicts could no longer explain the missing timeline. Detectives shifted their focus to something far more concrete and measurable: access, movement, and opportunity inside Brookhill Court. The working theory evolved from who might have been upset with Claire to who could have reached her without raising suspicion. The attention slowly turned toward people who did not need to knock, request entry, or be invited. Detectives contacted building management and requested the full maintenance log covering the 30 days leading up to February 10th. This included printed work order slips, handwritten correction notes, completion reports, and any informal maintenance memos. The goal was simple: confirm who had legitimate reasons to be near Unit 2A, when they were there, and whether any time blocks were unassigned, undocumented, or not tied to a tenant request. Once the files arrived, investigators began aligning the time-stamped entries with interview data and recorded building activity. Several residents recalled seeing maintenance presence around the building during random hours, but there was no strong memory of what was being fixed. At first glance, the logs appeared routine: minor plumbing requests, hallway bulb replacements, circuit breaker resets, and mechanical cabinet checks. However, a pattern slowly emerged when cross-referenced with resident interviews. Mark Ellison, the part-time maintenance subcontractor, was present on multiple dates and hours that did not match any documented repair requests. The records showed he had reason to be inside the building for work, but the frequency and location distribution around the second floor stood out. Further review revealed entries showing Mark near or on the second floor more often than any other maintenance worker. The log did not include written explanations for each appearance, which made it difficult to prove whether he was there by assignment or personal choice. One resident on the second floor recalled, "He seemed to be around that hallway a lot that month. I didn't think much of it because he always carried tools or something." Detectives then reviewed a separate interview given by a first-floor resident who remembered Mark asking a casual question days earlier. "Do you know around what time she usually gets home?" The resident initially assumed the question referred to a maintenance appointment window and did not perceive anything unusual about it. Although this detail did not serve as direct evidence, it became an important behavioral data point within an investigative framework that now prioritized access-driven variables. A separate administrative file revealed that Mark had once been disciplined internally in 1989 for keeping a building master key beyond permitted hours. The punishment was administrative only, without criminal implications. But it confirmed he understood the advantages of private access and how to navigate restricted spaces without drawing attention. This discovery prompted investigators to refine their working model. A person familiar with building structure, movement timing, and key-based entry processes could move almost invisibly. Detectives created a 3-column comparative timeline that included Mark's claimed whereabouts, official maintenance records, and all witness observations. This process exposed several unexplained gaps on the evening of February 10th. These time segments were not long enough to conclusively accuse anyone, but they were long enough to allow certain actions to take place without detection, especially in a building with no hallway cameras, no exterior gate monitoring, and limited foot traffic after dark. Given the convergence of repeated building presence, undefined time blocks, and technical accessibility, investigators secured a legal search warrant for Mark's rented room. The search was executed following standard chain of custody procedures. Items were documented, photographed, and collected only if they met criteria of potential connection. Inside, detectives discovered several small possessions belonging to tenants of Brookhill Court, none registered as stolen or valuable. They consisted mainly of everyday personal items, which made them difficult to classify as evidence or coincidence. Some residents later stated that such items might have been misplaced over time, while others admitted they had never noticed anything missing. Despite the limited outcome, the discovery raised another investigative question. Why would a maintenance subcontractor have everyday objects linked to different tenants if no formal work was recorded in their units? Detectives could not yet assign criminal meaning to the objects, but the context increased the probability that Mark had been inside multiple private living spaces without formal documentation. From this point forward, the theoretical model guiding the investigation shifted. The working narrative changed from emotional confrontation and unexpected exit to controlled access, privacy windows, and familiarity with unnoticed movement. Investigators began exploring the possibility that someone with legitimate authority inside the building could move without raising suspicion, adjust routines to avoid detection, and observe tenants' habits over weeks instead of hours. As a result of the evidence review and timeline reconstruction, detectives elevated Mark from person of interest to primary person of interest. His presence was no longer treated as coincidental or secondary. It became the central element requiring verification. The remaining 3 suspects, previously examined based on emotion-driven motives, were not officially cleared, but they no longer occupied the top tier of investigative attention. The case transitioned into a phase where behavior, access, and routine became core variables. The question was no longer who would want to harm Claire, but who had the power, knowledge, and opportunity to reach her inside Unit 2A without creating noise, suspicion, or forced entry. No conclusion was announced, no suspect was publicly accused, and no definitive theory was released. The investigation now depended on whether the next steps could match behavior with physical access in a building that offered silence, privacy, and unmonitored movement as part of its structure. As the weeks passed without a single verified sighting, the case file for Claire Donovan was no longer treated as a standard missing person report. Detectives rewrote the investigative framework, shifting away from emotional motives and personal connections, and placed full emphasis on who had real access, who had the right timing, and who could move without drawing attention. The updated report stated that the highest priority was no longer why someone might have acted against her, but who could have done it inside Brookhill Court without triggering noise, damage, or panic. With that new direction, the first 3 suspects remained present in the record, but they were moved down the hierarchy. Detectives noted that each man had theoretical emotional motive, unresolved interest, social rejection, or unpredictable intoxication. But none of them had confirmed access to Claire's locked apartment, nor evidence of being in the right physical location at the right time. None of them had a believable explanation for how they could enter and exit silently, without leaving tool marks, disturbance, or traceable activity. Detectives wrote, "Opportunity must outweigh motive, not the other way around." At the same time, the name Mark Ellison was no longer seen as a routine maintenance worker passing through the building. His pattern of movement became part of the case record. Multiple appearances near the second floor before Claire's disappearance, known knowledge of internal layouts, and unrestricted access to technical spaces and keys. A resident later recalled, "I always saw him around the hallways like he belonged there. Nobody questioned it." This quiet familiarity changed everything. His presence no longer looked random. It looked built in. Investigators created a 3-layer timeline to reevaluate what was once assumed. The first layer focused on access. Who could reach Unit 2A, stairwell corners, and service routes? The second layer analyzed movement. Who was seen, who was not seen, and whose presence would not trigger alarm if observed. The third layer labeled privacy windows, minutes and hours in which Claire was unaccounted for, with no witness, no phone activity, and no confirmed exit. That matrix replaced speculation with structured data. Once the matrix was complete, the investigative team submitted an internal request for second-phase forensic consideration. New discussions centered on trace patterns, micro-transfer possibilities, and contact evidence that could have existed but was undetectable with the tools available in early 1994. They listed surface-level reassessments, room-by-room re-entries, and potential involvement of external forensic agencies if the case later escalated into a criminal proceeding. A new interview strategy was drafted. The first round of questioning had focused heavily on emotional involvement, relationship history, and personal conflict, none of which produced a breakthrough. The second round focused on knowledge of the building, familiarity with noise patterns, routines, unmonitored corridors, and late-night access behavior. Investigators prepared questions designed to reveal whether anyone had an unusually confident sense of how people moved at Brookhill Court, how long lights stayed on, how often tenants locked doors, and how much sound traveled through each floor.
detectives also ordered a full witness remapping process. They realized that many residents may have dismissed unusual details because they viewed the maintenance staff as part of the building rather than outsiders. New interview guidelines instructed detectives to ask residents not only what they thought was normal, but whether they ever saw someone in a location that didn't match a work order, schedule, or emergency call. An officer wrote in his notes, "We are now asking people to report behavior they assumed was harmless." In addition, longer-term residents who had lived at Brookhill Court for more than one leasing cycle were prioritized in the new witness shortlist. These individuals were more likely to detect subtle changes, late-night activity, unscheduled presence, or behavior that slowly became part of the environment. One resident shared, "You stop noticing someone if they're always around. They become part of the building, not a person you evaluate." That statement became significant enough to be included in the official document. As investigators pieced together behavior patterns, the internal memo grew more direct. A line was recorded. Suspect profile likely normalized within environment and socially de-escalated by occupational role, resulting in low perceived threat. Meaning, if someone blended into the building, no witness would instinctively label them as suspicious, even if they were present at unusual hours. With that, the investigative status changed. Claire's case was no longer defined by missing person guidelines. It was officially reclassified as active review, pending physical or testimonial breakthrough, acknowledging that the solution would most likely come from improved analysis, delayed reporting, or new scientific capability, not from sudden confession or casual discovery. Investigators understood that cases involving familiarity-based access often remain silent for long periods because no assumptions are challenged. However, detectives agreed on one more thing. They would not release speculative statements to the public. It was noted that premature conclusions could distort witness memory, influence future testimony, or provoke defensive behavior from any individual involved. Until evidence or confession aligned, every line of questioning needed to remain neutral and professional. Official updates released to the public simply repeated that the investigation was ongoing, with no confirmed suspect or verified reconstruction of Claire's final movements. Meanwhile, Unit 2A remained sealed. Detectives stated that all items, surfaces, and structural areas must stay untouched for potential future forensic re-entry if new technology became available. They insisted that the value of the scene may increase over time instead of decrease because future methods could identify what 1994 tools could not. The sealed door became the last intact part of Claire's known life, holding every unanswered question: who entered, why it remained silent, what happened after 6 p.m., and why she was never seen again. The case stayed open with one final, unspoken acknowledgement. Someone inside that building knew more than they ever said.
If you followed the story to this point, I'd like to hear what you think, based on the evidence so far. Who stands closest to opportunity? Who had the safest cover? Who benefited from silence? Comment your thoughts below. Even the smallest detail or theory matters in cases like this.